Right, so Hezbollah have finally snapped, finally retaliated against Israel's incessant breaking of the Lebanon ceasefire, which came into effect just under a week ago now, but which Israel have basically been ignoring from the very beginning. The total number of ceasefire breaches, from strikes to blocking Lebanese citizens returning to their homes to aircraft flyovers, has now reportedly passed 100 incidents in 5 days, which Lebanon and Hezbollah have followed the terms of the agreement to the letter through the duration of. This ceasefire is supposed to be in place for the next 60 days, yet Israel have basically acted as if no ceasefire came into effect at all. Well, Hezbollah have fired what they've called a warning shot over Israel's constant breaches, but in true Israeli fashion, they've now pointed to this strike, stamped their tiny feet, and screamed victimhood once again. The ceasefire is hanging by a thread, but what else was going to happen when one side had no intention of honouring it? And that absolutely has not been Hezbollah or the Lebanese Army.
Where does the ceasefire stand now?
Well, it did not collapse. It did not break down. It faced its biggest test on Monday with the flare-up in hostilities. Hezbollah, for the first time, fired rockets across the border, saying it targeted an Israeli military position in an area disputed by Lebanon. It said that it was an initial defensive warning and that it carried out the attack as a warning to Israel, which continues, according to Hezbollah, to violate the terms of the ceasefire agreement. Israel called it a mistake, a grave violation, and it promised a harsh response. It did carry out a series of airstrikes, the largest wave of strikes since the ceasefire took effect last week, and 9 people were killed in 2 towns in southern Lebanon. And earlier in the day, 2 other people were killed. So 11 Lebanese were killed in the past 24 hours. Now, while that ceasefire holds, no doubt it stands on a shaky ground. Israel is trying to create a new reality, how it understands the terms of the agreement, that it has a right to carry out attacks and strikes on what it considers threats by Hezbollah. Hezbollah sees it differently, and the reason, when it launched that rocket attack, it followed statements by both the United States and France, 2 members of a committee that's supposed to implement and monitor the ceasefire, saying that Israel violated the truce. So what Israel is trying to do is create a situation where it can act with little restraint against any position it considers a threat. What Hezbollah wants to do is change this. It needs some sort of a deterrence, and it doesn't want to seem to remain idle. So right now, the situation is calm. The U.S. envoy Amos Hochstein saying to the Israelis, give the ceasefire monitoring mechanism time to start working. But we have to wait to see in the coming hours and days ahead whether the ceasefire will hold.
Right, so that footage there was a short explainer of literally what's been happening the last 24 hours, courtesy of Al Jazeera, and it seems pretty blatant that Israel have broken the terms of the ceasefire agreement. Even the US and French monitors, according to that, have said as much. So now Israel are trying to twist everything to reinterpret the terms of the ceasefire, with the implication being that they are allowed to continue attacking Lebanon, but Lebanon and Hezbollah have no right to defend themselves. A sovereign state with no right of self-defense? I'm pretty sure they didn't sign up to that, yet this apparently is where we are in the eyes of the Israelis. 100 Israeli breaches of the ceasefire and Hezbollah have responded. They targeted a site being held by the IDF in Rawasat al-Alam in the occupied Lebanese Kfar Shuba Hills. Israel called this a grave mistake, and after Hezbollah targeted their military position there, Israel does what it always seems to and targets civilians instead. 2 southern Lebanese villages were the targets, 5 killed in the village of Haris, wounding 2 others, and in the village of Talusa, 4 were killed and 2 more were wounded. At least 12 Lebanese people have been reported as having been killed in Israeli retaliatory strikes at time of writing, though. So evidently, either some of those injured have now passed, or further fatalities elsewhere are also known about, but not published in the reports that I've seen. Anyway, the Israeli government, always plentiful in the brass neck department, have, following all of this, stated that if the ceasefire fails, it will now be on Hezbollah, and they must be held account for that, such as the narrative coming from the new defence minister, at least, Israel Katz. And if that comes to pass, Israel itself will no longer differentiate, apparently, between Lebanon and Hezbollah. Well, you did just target Lebanese civilians in villages when Hezbollah struck one of your military positions. following more than 100 incidents you have committed in breach of the ceasefire already, so blatant that even the US monitor is saying you've breached them. So when have you ever actually differentiated between Lebanon and Hezbollah anyway? If anything, your differentiation implies Hezbollah are too scary for you. Best stick with hitting those you feel best able to take on, like the blatant cowards you are, which take in innocent women and children. The ceasefire agreement is poorly worded, poorly written. Some have expressed surprise Lebanon agreed to it. There's a feeling that Lebanon may have ceded to pressure to agree to it as a result of that. But it states that all Lebanese groups will cease all military action on Israel, whilst Israel has 60 days, the full duration of that ceasefire period, temporary as it is. It's a truce. It's a pause. That would more accurately describe it. They have 60 days to leave southern Lebanon. Essentially, they can take the full 2 months to get out of Lebanon, in which case, and then re-invade the very next day. Israel, in return, must cease any offensive military action against Lebanon, and the problem with that basically writes itself. Israel will call its ongoing actions, no matter what they might be, defensive ones. So let's have a look at one such example in the last 24 hours of Israel's defensive attacks then. Here's an excerpt from Middle East Monitor from a piece they put out just this morning. Israeli military bulldozers yesterday completely demolished a mosque in the town of Maroun al-Ras in the Bint Jbeil district of southern Lebanon, in violation of the ceasefire agreement signed between Tel Aviv and Hezbollah last week. According to Lebanon's official news agency, bulldozers belonging to the Israeli occupation army razed the mosque in Maroun al-Ras yesterday afternoon, destroying it entirely. 2 Lebanese nationals were also killed and others injured in 6 separate Israeli breaches. The Israeli army continues to occupy several Lebanese towns near the southern border, stopping Lebanese civilians from accessing their land. Go ahead, Zionists, explain how destroying a mosque is a defensive action, or stopping people going home. How's that a defensive action? Well, I suppose these Zionists do find mosques offensive, but they don't take offensive actions. Was Hezbollah inside then? Oh no, they pulled out of southern Lebanon as per the ceasefire agreement. You can't play that card this time. Or is everyone and everything Hezbollah again, just as everything and everyone in Gaza was Hamas and there are no innocents? How is that differentiating between the Lebanese people and Hezbollah then? Is it the same in Lebanon too now as it is in Gaza? I suppose the missile strikes that you rained down on them were defensive too, even though nobody actually attacked you. The bomb strikes, I dare say, you'll say the same thing. Defensive drone strikes as well. Again, offensive civilian buildings, is it? Same old story. We know the drill by now, don't we? But this was just one instance of over 100 breaches of the ceasefire by Israel, where Israel haven't been provoked, and the ceasefire has only been in place for 5 days. Well, as I've said, even the monitors aren't buying it. But Israel will keep trying to sell it, and bought and paid for politicians in the West, along with Western media, will keep pushing that narrative and repeat ad nauseum that Israel has a right to defend itself, when nobody else ever seems to have a right to defend themselves against Israel. Disagree and you'll probably be called an anti-Semite, of course. But the thing that surprises me most are the reports that the pro-Israel monitors of the situation, the US and France, are actually calling Israel out, or at the very least agreeing that they are breaching the ceasefire. But that won't necessarily materialise in any meaningful action. It won't stop weapons sales, will it? Nothing seems to stop the US doing that. It won't herald sanctions. It won't change anything. It won't stop the US vetoing, UN Security Council votes on such matters. Israel will get a free pass, and Lebanon would, I'd hope, learn a valuable lesson here, that there can be no peace and there can be no ceasefire when Israel has no intention of stopping. And those negotiating ceasefires have no intention of holding them to account or to the same standard as others. Israel is always treated differently. They know it, and everyone else now knows it. They know it better than ever. It's why they permanently wail that they are the victims as they launch strike after strike against others. Oh, it's all self-defense, though. Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel's right to defend itself again. And of course, whilst the US is saying Israel are conducting all these breaches, those aforementioned missiles and bombs and drones are almost certainly US-made. And again, we're reminded the US administration can literally stop all of this in a heartbeat, but instead choose to keep it going instead. Of course, one major reason for that is that the US view Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation. Therefore, any attacks that Israel makes that they say are defensive and are against Hezbollah, even as more civilians in Lebanon are actually the ones that are dying at their hands. But the US will accept that reasoning. Insane and dishonest as it is, they'll accept it. And so the weapons and munitions will keep flowing. Israel will call it counter-terrorism and not an offensive. They'll say it's self-defense, and that will be perfectly acceptable to the US administration. But it isn't acceptable to us. In the last 5 days of this ceasefire, that's been going, that's as long as it's been going for. Bombs have gone off in Lebanon, missiles have fallen, mosques have been targeted, innocent civilians in villages have been targeted, a funeral was targeted, journalists again have been shot at, ambulances have been shot at, and we're supposed to believe this is all defensive? Well, we saw it all happen already in Gaza. It's happening again now in Lebanon. Are we really going to be sucked in twice? Al Jazeera might be saying the ceasefire is holding still today, but not in practice. It had never existed for Israel in practice. It only counted against Lebanon. Israel have had carte blanche in Lebanon to do what they like for 5 days and have done so. They mustn't get away now with saying Hezbollah are the ones who are breaking it when they never followed it from day one. If Israel want to talk terrorism, they should look to themselves. They should look in the mirror, especially when you think of Lebanon and your thoughts still get drawn to that pager attack of which we've now seen a second one. Except this time it wasn't Hezbollah targeted, but the Syrian army. As Israel supports the destabilization of that country now, as Israel-backed rebels, we should absolutely call them that, Israel-backed rebels, the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Syria, in fact, as they are, attempt to topple the Assad regime. Get all the details of that latest pager attack in this video recommendation here, as you suggested next watch. Please support the channel by clicking like, share and subscribe if you haven't already done so. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.